It was a warm Friday evening in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. Inside the Charleston Room, a high-end restaurant with white tablecloths, polished silverware, and soft jazz humming from the speakers, guests were already seated, sipping wine and chatting over filet mignon and crab cakes. In the far corner of the dining room sat a glossy black grand piano, untouched, more of a decoration than a centerpiece. Moving swiftly between tables was Danielle Brooks, a 25-year-old waitress with a composed face and a calm, deliberate manner. She wasn't flashy, she didn't speak much unless spoken to, but there was something about her steady hands, a quiet focus that made her stand out to anyone who cared to notice. Danielle wasn't born into wealth. She grew up in Lancaster, a small town in South Carolina. Her mother, a single parent and registered nurse, worked double shifts for most of Danielle's childhood just to keep the lights on and food on the table. Danielle shared a bedroom with her two younger brothers and learned early on how to carry more than her share of responsibility. Their house was modest, but in the corner of the living room sat a second-hand upright piano with chipped keys and faded varnish. It had been a gift from a neighbor who couldn't afford repairs. Most kids would have seen it as junk. Danielle saw it as her world. She taught herself to play using hand-me-down music books from the church and old CDs from the thrift store. She played for hours, sometimes practicing until her fingers hurt. By the time she was a teenager, she was performing at school recitals, Sunday services, and local events. Music became her escape and her identity. But real life didn't leave much room for dreams. By age 18, Danielle had applied to music schools across the South. She got accepted to 2, but the scholarships didn't cover enough, and her family couldn't afford the rest. Her mom needed help with bills, and Danielle had no choice but to go to work. She waited tables at diners, then hotel restaurants. The Charleston Room was her best job so far, mostly because it paid well, and because of that grand piano in the corner. It was rarely touched. Some nights, if the floor manager wasn't watching and the room was empty, she'd sit at the bench for a minute during her break and let her fingers remember what they used to do. Most of the staff didn't know she played. She didn't talk about it. Not because she was ashamed, but because it was easier to keep that part of herself safe, quiet. This night started like many others. The restaurant filled with regulars and weekend guests. Danielle kept her pace steady, refilling water, clearing dishes, remembering who liked lemon with their iced tea and who didn't want pepper on their steak. But then, just before 8:00 p.m., the front door opened. A man in a custom navy blue suit stepped inside, trailed by 2 younger men in sport coats. He walked in like he owned the place. Charles Whitmore III. Even if you didn't know his name, you'd know the type. Tall, loud, confident to the point of arrogance. He was the CEO of Whitmore Capital, a well-known venture investor who'd made headlines for turning small companies into billion-dollar enterprises. He also had a reputation charming in public, but ruthless in private. Staff members exchanged glances the second they saw him. Danielle had served him once before, months ago. He had made a few snide remarks back then, but she'd shrugged them off. Tonight, as she approached his table with menus, she felt his eyes on her. Not just a glance. He was watching her carefully, too carefully. He smiled faintly, like he'd already decided something in his mind. Danielle didn't react. She placed the menus down, filled his water glass, and moved to the next table. But in the back of her mind, something told her. Tonight wouldn't go like the others. And she was right. Charles Whitmore had come in for dinner. But what he really wanted was a show. Charles Whitmore III didn't just walk into the Charleston Room, made an entrance. The kind that drew glances from every table near the front. Dressed in a custom navy suit with a silk pocket square, he carried the confidence of someone used to having doors opened for him and people lowering their voices when he passed. 2 younger men in sharp blazers followed behind him, all of them laughing at something Charles had just said, probably at someone else's expense. The staff noticed right away. Danielle Brooks noticed too. Charles Whitmore wasn't just a well-known tech billionaire. He was the kind of man who made headlines both for buying companies and for belittling people who couldn't afford valet parking. To those who had worked at the Charleston room long enough, Charles was trouble wrapped in money. Loud, arrogant, and always looking to turn someone into the evening's entertainment, especially if he thought they couldn't fight back. Danielle had only served him once before, months ago. He'd made a few snide remarks that night, nothing she hadn't learned to ignore. But tonight, something felt different. As she moved through the dining room, balancing a tray with 2 sparkling waters and a pair of wine glasses, she caught Charles's eye. He stared longer than was appropriate. She looked away, focused on her steps, and made a smooth turn toward another table. But it was too late. He'd noticed her, and worse, he had decided. Charles and his party were seated at table 9, the one near the fireplace with the best view of the piano in the corner. Danielle approached with quiet efficiency, setting down cocktail napkins and offering them a practiced, neutral smile. Charles glanced at her name tag. "Danielle," he said, slowly, like he was trying it out. "Danielle Brooks. That sounds like someone with a lot of hidden talents." Danielle kept her expression polite. "Can I get you started with anything to drink, sir?" He leaned back in his chair, placing his elbows on the arms like a king in a throne. "Top-shelf scotch. Neat. And bring something light for my friends. They can't handle the real stuff." His companions chuckled on cue. Danielle nodded and turned to leave, but Charles wasn't finished. "Tell me, Danielle," he called out, just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, "what do you do when you're not carrying plates?" She paused mid-step, turning back slightly. "Excuse me? Surely a young woman like you has dreams," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. "I mean, you don't plan on serving tables forever, do you?" Danielle stiffened for just a moment, then answered softly, "I play piano sometimes, on my own time." "Ah," Charles said, grinning. "A pianist. How fascinating." The way he said it made it sound like a joke. His companions leaned in, clearly enjoying where this was headed. Danielle walked away without another word. She moved back toward the bar, keeping her posture steady. But inside, her stomach was tightening. She had dealt with arrogant customers before, but this felt calculated, cold. He wasn't just rude. He was watching her, testing her. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like playful banter. But for those who know what humiliation feels like, especially when delivered with a smile, it was obvious. This was no accident. And friends, if you've ever seen someone try to shrink another person just to feel bigger, you already know where this is going. If stories like these matter to you, if you believe in grace under pressure and dignity in the face of cruelty, consider subscribing for more real, honest storytelling. Danielle's story is just getting started. Back at Charles's table, the mood had shifted. He wasn't just making conversation anymore, he was performing. Loud enough for neighboring tables to hear, he launched into tales of his business deals, his luxury properties, and the private jet he'd recently upgraded. Between those stories, he made sure to toss in comments about people who lacked ambition or who settled for mediocrity. One by one, his companions laughed along, nodding like background actors in a bad play. Danielle continued her work, clearing dishes and refilling water, doing her best to ignore him. But his presence lingered like a shadow. She moved between tables with the same focus she always had, but Charles's voice followed her. Every time she passed by, she could feel his eyes on her, like a weight. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't stop. But inside, something was building. Pressure, frustration, maybe even defiance. She knew that look in his eye. He wasn't finished. He had decided that tonight, Danielle Brooks was going to be the story he told the next morning over brunch. Or maybe in a tweet. What he didn't know was that Danielle had already faced harder nights than this, and that the girl with the quiet smile and the forgotten talent wasn't going to disappear so easily. Not tonight. Not in front of that piano. Danielle Brooks tried to stay focused. She had cleared 2 tables and was returning to Charles Whitmore's with a bottle of red wine and 3 crystal glasses. Her movements were practiced and steady, her smile neutral. Just another table. Just another night. But as she leaned forward to pour the wine, Charles cut through the air like a knife. "Tell me, Danielle," he said, his voice loud enough for nearby diners to hear. "What do you do when you're not carrying plates?" Danielle froze. The bottle paused just above his glass. She glanced at him briefly, unsure if he was serious or just baiting her again. "Well, I play piano sometimes," she said softly, then looked away, trying to keep it casual. "Just for myself." Charles's eyes lit up. A smile curled across his face, amused in the worst way. "A pianist, huh?" he said, sitting back and folding his arms. "How fascinating." Danielle didn't respond. She placed the wine bottle down and turned to leave. But Charles raised his voice. "Why don't you give us a little performance?" he said, grinning. "There's a piano right over there. Let's see what you've got." Danielle stopped in her tracks. The room around her seemed to still. Conversations at nearby tables slowed. A spoon paused halfway to someone's mouth. The air changed, not loud, not silent, but expectant. She turned back to him, clearly flustered. "Oh, I couldn't," she said quickly, laughing nervously. "I'm just working tonight." Charles wasn't having it. He leaned forward again, his voice louder now, his words deliberately theatrical. "Nonsense. There's a beautiful grand piano in the corner, just waiting for someone with talent. You do have talent, right?" His companions laughed. Not loudly, but enough. Enough for her to feel it. Danielle could feel the heat rising in her face. She looked to the corner of the dining room. There it was, the piano. She had admired it every shift, stolen glances during breaks. It was a part of the reason she had applied here in the first place. But this wasn't how she imagined sitting at it. "I really shouldn't," she said again, softer now, eyes darting to other staff members as if searching for a lifeline. But her co-workers stayed back, uncertain, uncomfortable, unwilling to step in. Charles reached for his scotch and took a slow sip, never taking his eyes off her. Then he delivered the final blow. "Ah, I see," he said, drawing out each word with mock disappointment. "All talk, no talent. That's disappointing." The words didn't need volume, they carried a sting all on their own. It hit her hard. Danielle stood there, frozen. Her hands clenched at her sides. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her. It wasn't the first time someone assumed a uniform meant she had nothing to offer. But something about the way he said it, so public, so deliberate, made it different. It was calculated. He didn't want music. He wanted control. She looked around. Diners were now fully tuned in. Heads were turned. Eyes were watching. Charles Whitmore had made her the center of the evening. But not in admiration, in mockery. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't let anyone shrink you just to make themselves look bigger." Danielle took a slow breath. She looked back at Charles. His smirk hadn't changed. His posture was relaxed. He thought he had her boxed in, one comment away from walking away with her head down. But instead of replying, Danielle turned her head toward the grand piano again. The same one she had never dared to touch during service. The one she had admired quietly from a distance for over a year. Something shifted in her posture. She stepped back from the table, slowly, calmly. Not running, not flustered, just moving with intention. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Fine," she said. "I'll play." You could have heard a pin drop. Even Charles blinked, briefly thrown off. But then he leaned back, grinning wider, thinking he had won the moment, thinking she'd perform nervously, mess up, and become the punchline of the night. Danielle walked through the dining room, each step heavy with the weight of what was happening. This wasn't a recital. This wasn't church. This was a teststone she hadn't asked for, but one she'd been handed anyway. And across the room, as she approached the piano, every person in that restaurant now waited. Danielle Brooks wasn't someone who looked for confrontation. She had always believed in handling things with grace and restraint. But there was something about the way Charles Whitmore had spoken to her, like she was a joke, like she didn't matter, that cut deeper than she expected. Not just because it embarrassed her, but because it told her, in front of everyone, that he thought she had nothing to offer. And in that moment, a voice rose in her mind. Her mother's voice. "Don't you ever let anyone make you feel small, Danielle. You're bigger than they'll ever understand." The silence at table 9 stretched out. Charles sat with his glass of scotch. A smug smile settled across his face, arms draped over the chair as if he'd already won whatever game he was playing. His companions stared at Danielle like they were waiting for her to retreat. She looked at the piano, then back at him, and against her better judgment, she made her choice. "Fine," Danielle said, her voice low but steady. "I'll play." Around the room, heads turned. Conversations stopped. Silverware was set down gently on white porcelain plates. The air inside the Charleston room changed. The diners weren't sure what had just happened, but they knew they were about to witness something out of the ordinary. Danielle stepped away from the table and began walking toward the grand piano in the far corner. Each footstep echoed faintly over the hardwood floor. Every step carried not just nervous energy but a quiet, growing defiance. She had been taught all her life to stay composed, stay humble, stay quiet. But staying quiet tonight would mean letting someone like Charles define her worth. Not tonight. As she neared the piano, the chandelier above glowed softly, casting a warm light on the glossy surface. The room fell so still that you could hear the faint hum of the cooling system overhead. Danielle reached the bench and stood for a moment, her hands at her sides. She could feel the heat of a dozen pairs of eyes on her. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, not from strangers, and certainly not in this context. Behind her, Charles leaned back in his chair, satisfied. To him, this was entertainment, a performance he assumed would be awkward, maybe even pitiful. The idea of her fumbling at the keys in front of a crowd probably delighted him. Danielle slowly lowered herself onto the bench. Her hands trembled as she reached for the keys. She hadn't played in public in over 2 years, not since the last time she filled in at her old church during Christmas service. This was different. This wasn't a community gathering. This wasn't friendly. This was hostile. She closed her eyes, trying to still her breath. Her heart was pounding hard enough that she felt it in her throat. Then, with her eyes still closed, she placed both hands gently on the keys. The first few notes came out quiet, hesitant, fragile. Someone coughed in the back. A fork scraped gently across a plate. There were a few murmurs. But Danielle didn't stop. She kept playing. The song she chose was one she knew by heart, Clair de Lune by Claude Debussy. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was delicate, soulful. A piece filled with pauses, layers, and emotion. And as the melody began to take shape, something in the room shifted. Danielle's fingers moved slowly at first, then with more assurance. Her back straightened, her posture settled. The notes began to flow like water clear, steady, with a strength that belied the nervous chaos inside her. The music wove through the air like a thread, stitching silence across the room. Diners leaned forward. Conversations stopped altogether. A waiter paused mid-step. A man at the bar set his drink down without drinking it. Even Charles stopped talking. Danielle wasn't just playing notes. Every key she touched carried weight. Her story was in the music, every missed opportunity, every long night spent practicing in a tiny room while her mother worked the night shift, every concert dream that had been pushed aside so she could pay rent and take care of her brothers. She wasn't performing to prove a point. She was simply playing the truth. And the truth was beautiful. The music swelled, soft and full. Her hands moved with ease, no sheet music, no plan, just muscle memory and feeling. She wasn't thinking anymore. She was remembering, feeling, reclaiming. As the final few notes drifted into the air and faded, Danielle let her hands rest on the keys. No one spoke. No one moved. There was only silence. And then, like a wave, breaking applause. Thunderous, rising from every corner of the restaurant. It wasn't polite. It wasn't obligatory. It was genuine. Several diners stood. Some clapped with tears in their eyes. Others smiled in stunned amazement. Staff members peeked out from the kitchen to see what had happened. One of Danielle's co-workers gave a quiet, proud fist pump near the host stand. Back at table 9, Charles's smile was gone. He sat still, his scotch untouched, staring toward the piano. His companions didn't look at him. No one was laughing anymore. Danielle remained seated for just a second longer, collecting herself. Her hands were still shaking, but not from fear this time. From release. From relief. Then she stood, smoothed the front of her uniform, and gave a slight nod toward the crowd. It wasn't pride she felt. It wasn't even triumph. It was something quieter, something deeper. She hadn't let him make her small. And that, in itself, was enough. Danielle Brooks sat at the grand piano in the Charleston room, her fingers poised over the keys. For a moment, the silence felt overwhelming, thick, expectant. The chandeliers above cast soft reflections on the piano's polished surface, turning the instrument into a mirror of everything she carried inside. Fear, frustration, and years of deferred dreams. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and let her hands begin. The first notes of Clair de Lune floated softly into the air. They were tentative at first, like someone testing their footing after a long fall. The melody drifted, delicate, and almost uncertain. A few diners stirred in their seats. Someone near the back coughed once, then stopped. Even the waitstaff paused quietly behind the kitchen door. But then something changed. As Danielle's fingers moved with growing confidence, the music swelled. What started as a whisper turned into a her voice. The tempo steadied, her hands gaining strength, memory guiding motion. She wasn't reading sheet music. She didn't need to. She had lived this piece. Each note was a part of her story. Each chord a memory. Each phrase a prayer she had once thought no one would hear. The melody flowed like a confession, the long hours practicing on a hand-me-down piano with uneven keys, the nights when her mother worked back-to-back shifts so her children could eat, the ache of watching other kids chase dreams she could only afford to imagine. It all came pouring out in a song that had no words only truth. The dining room held still. Forks rested beside untouched food. Wine glasses remained half-raised. No one whispered. No one moved. Every head in the room turned toward the far corner, toward the young woman who had been delivering steak and water not 15 minutes ago and was now performing like someone born for the stage. Even Charles Whitmore had gone silent. The smugness had faded from his face. His hands, once theatrically resting behind his head, now sat motionless on the table. Danielle didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel it. The shift. The mood of the room had transformed not with a bang, but with the quiet authority of something undeniable. She wasn't a waitress. She wasn't a charity case. She wasn't a joke. She was an artist. Her fingers danced across the keys not stiffly, not rehearsed, but freely, with grace and power. It was as if the piano wasn't just an instrument anymore, but an extension of heron arm she'd always had, but had been told not to use. And as the notes moved from soft introspection to a fuller, richer harmony, Danielle let go. Let go of the fear, the second-guessing, the years of being overlooked. For the first time in what felt like forever, she played without apology. The music lingered in the air like something sacred, as if the sound itself held weight hung there, suspended, too beautiful to break. Then, at last, she reached the final chords. A soft, elegant finish. No drama, no showmanship, just pure, heartfelt release. And then nothing. For a few seconds, the room was completely still. No applause, no movement, just silence. Danielle sat motionless, her hands still resting gently on the keys. Her chest rose and fell, her breathing uneven. She didn't dare look up. Not yet. Then someone clapped. And another. And another. Within seconds, the room erupted in thunderous applause. The sound rolled through the restaurant, echoing off the walls, rising from every corner. Several diners stood to their feet. One woman near the front wiped a tear from her cheek. A man at the back gave a loud, approving whistle. The energy was not polite, it was electric. Danielle's co-workers emerged from behind the service area. One of the younger servers pumped his fist in the air. The hostess, usually composed, clapped with both hands above her head, grinning ear to ear. Even the head chef peeked out from the kitchen, shaking his head in amazement. Danielle looked up, eyes wide, heart pounding. She didn't expect this, not the ovation, not the emotion. She had only wanted to protect her dignity. Instead, she had taken back something far greater. A few feet away, at table 9, Charles remained seated. His hands rested on the table, unmoving. The self-assured smirk he wore earlier had vanished. His eyes, now narrowed, weren't full of mockery. They were searching, calculating, maybe even questioning what just happened. Eventually, almost begrudgingly, he raised his hands and began to clap, slowly, softly. But his clapping was drowned out by the room around him. His attempt to save, face muted by the collective recognition that Danielle had just done something extraordinary. She didn't just meet the moment. She redefined it. No one at his table dared to speak. Danielle slowly stood up from the bench. Her knees were trembling, but she stood tall, her back straight, her expression calm. She looked across the room, not at Charles but at the people who had clapped the hardest, the ones who had seen her, the ones who had understood. She gave a small, almost humble nod of thanks. It wasn't triumph she felt. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. She had nothing to prove. She had everything to reclaim. The last notes of the piano still lingered faintly in the air when Danielle Brooks stood up from the bench. For a second, she didn't move, just breathed. Then came the voices. A woman in her 70s, seated near the front, stood and placed a hand over her heart. Her eyes were glassy. "Young lady," she said softly, "you just gave us something more beautiful than I've heard in years." Another diner, a retired music teacher, nodded and added, "That wasn't just playing, that was living. That came from the soul." Danielle smiled, small, grateful, and a little stunned. As she stepped away from the piano, people reached out. Gently, one man touched her arm as she passed. "You've got a gift," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Her co-workers hovered by the side, clapping, whispering to each other. One of them, Tanya, whispered under her breath, "I had no idea." The mood in the room had shifted entirely. There was no longer any laughter at her expense, no whispering behind napkins. There was only admiration, respect, and something deeper, remorse from those who had underestimated her. Except at table 9. Charles Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks, his smile thin and mechanical. Trying to salvage his pride, he raised his glass and said just loud enough to be heard, "Talent really does come from the most surprising places." It was meant to sound like a compliment. It landed like an afterthought. Danielle turned to him. Her voice was calm, even, steady. "Everyone has talent," she said. "What matters is how we use it." The words weren't sharp, they weren't angry, but they landed with finality like a door closing. Charles didn't answer, neither did his companions. The table that once buzzed with smug grins and private jokes now sat quiet. Their earlier confidence had drained from their faces, replaced by something more complicated: embarrassment, maybe even shame. One of the younger men at the table cleared his throat, looked down at his napkin. Another sipped his wine too quickly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Danielle didn't linger. She nodded politely and turned to return to work, her apron still tied around her waist, her expression composed. But the room never saw her the same again. She wasn't just the waitress anymore. She was the woman who stood up for herself. The woman who played like her life was in every note. The woman who silenced a room not with power but with purpose. And Charles Whitmore, the man who tried to humiliate her for sport, he was left to sit in the silence he created. For the first time that evening, it was clear who held the real power. And it wasn't him. The restaurant had mostly returned to its rhythm servers refilling water, quiet clinks of cutlery, but the atmosphere was different now, warmer, more grounded. Danielle, now back in her station, carried herself differently. She wasn't rushing, wasn't shrinking. She moved with calm certainty. Then Charles Whitmore beckoned her over. She approached his table slowly, sensing the tension. The laughter and cocky energy that had defined his group earlier had vanished. They looked like a team that had just lost a game they thought was rigged in their favor. He slid the bill toward her, signed and folded. His tone was tight, his smile forced. "You did well," he said. "No need to overdo it." It was meant to reassert control, a reminder that, to him, she was still just the help, still someone he could patronize. Danielle met his eyes. No fear, no bitterness. "I was never trying to prove anything to you," she said quietly. "I just wanted to play." Her voice didn't rise. She didn't posture. But the words cut through the air like a clean blade. Charles looked away first. Then came something unexpected. One of his companions, Kyle, the younger man who had stayed mostly quiet all night, spoke up. "You were amazing," he said. His voice was soft, sincere. "Thank you." Danielle paused. That she hadn't expected. She nodded, offering him a small smile. "You're welcome." Then she turned and walked away. The group didn't call for a valet, didn't wave for more wine, didn't demand attention. They gathered their things in silence and slipped out the front door without another word. No dramatic exit, no lingering arrogance. Just the quiet of people who had been publicly and undeniably humbled. Danielle watched them go from behind the host stand, her arms folded loosely, her expression unreadable. They left behind no footprints. But Shesh left behind an impression no one would forget. Over the next few days, whispers turned into shares. A woman who had been dining with her grandkids posted a short clip of Danielle's performance with the caption, "This young woman stopped a restaurant with a piano. Watch until the end." Within hours, it had thousands of views, then tens of thousands. Someone else posted a longer version, the full performance, Danielle's quiet response to Charles, and the standing ovation. Hashtags followed. Piano waitress, real talent, La Fontaine miracle. News blogs picked it up. Local radio hosts mentioned it in between traffic and weather. But Danielle didn't check the numbers. She didn't count the likes. She sat in her small apartment on the edge of the city, in the same second-hand chair she always used, beside the same scratched-up upright piano that had followed her through 3 moves. It was a Sunday morning. The light through the window was soft and golden. She didn't wear anything fancy, just her old sweatshirt and jeans, sleeves pushed up. Her hands hovered over the keys. Then they moved. No camera, no audience. Just her, the music, and the quiet hum of possibility. She played without hesitation. The melodies poured out not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, just to speak. A few days later, her phone rang. The voice on the other end was warm and direct. "Miss Brooks? My name's Benjamin Hall. I was at La Fontaine the other night. I run a small music production company based out of Nashville. I saw something real in your playing. I'm not offering you a record deal, not yet at least, but I'd like you to come in and record a demo. No pressure, just a chance." Danielle sat in silence for a beat. Her heart thudded. Not because it was a promise of fame, but because it was real. A door she hadn't expected. A door she was now ready to walk through. "Okay," she said, voice steady. "Let's do it." That night, she stayed up late, not watching the viral clips or reading the comments, but playing through old notebooks of songs she hadn't touched in years. She reworked melodies, experimented with phrasing. For the first time, she felt no need to hide her aspirations, no need to shrink. And she knew. She had finally crossed a threshold. She wasn't just the girl behind the apron anymore. She wasn't just the waitress who had played one remarkable piece. She was an artist. And now, she knew it. Final line. She was no longer a waitress. She was an artist. And she knew it. Absolutely. Here's the updated version with a call to subscribe and a warm, respectful farewell tailored to an older American audience. In life, we are often judged by how we look, where we work, or what others think we're capable of. But Danielle's story reminds us that dignity is not tied to titles or wealth. It comes from knowing your worth, standing tall in the face of doubt, and doing what you love with integrity. She wasn't trying to prove herself to anyone. She just wanted to play. And by staying true to that, she opened a door she never expected. For those of us in our later years, it's easy to believe that our time to shine has passed, that we've missed the window for something new or meaningful. But it's never too late to be seen, to be heard, or to follow that quiet passion still sitting in the corner of your life, waiting. You don't need applause to matter. You just need the courage to show up and be yourself. No matter your age, your background, or your past, you still have something to offer. Something real. Danielle found it behind a piano. You might find it somewhere else. The important thing is this: don't let others define your value. And never stop believing you still have a moment left to live out loud. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel for more true stories of strength, dignity, and second chances. Until next time, take good care of yourself, stay proud of who you are, and we'll see you in the next video. God bless.